Athens is mid-Peloponnesian War when the small city of Egesta asks for help against Sycharus. At home, the pitch gets even bigger. Take Sycharus, control Sicilian grain, and flank Sparta's network. The assembly approves an enormous expedition, over 100 triremes and thousands of men, because what could possibly go wrong with a war across 1,000 kilometers of water? Command is split between three very different leaders: Alcibiades, the ambitious schemer, Nicias, the cautious veteran, and Lamachus, the fighter. But before they even settle on a plan, Alcibiades is recalled to stand trial in a religious scandal, and defects to Sparta. Despite the setback, Athens lands near Sycharus and tries talking first. That goes nowhere. So they pivot to a siege by engineering, by building a wall around the city. Early progress looks pretty promising. Then Sparta finally remembers that it's Sparta and sends Gylippus, a very capable commander who rallies the Sycharusans and cuts into Athenian works with counterwalls and forces constant grinding fights on the ground that favors the defenders. In one of those clashes, Lamachus, the aggressive half of the remaining Athenian brain trust, is killed. Command consolidates under Nicias, who is sick, cautious, and now responsible for an operation that needs momentum more than meetings. The war shifts onto the water. Sycharus forces the Athenians to fight inside the great harbor. Tight water, short lanes, lots of collisions. Athenian seamanship, normally their superpower, gets screwed over by the location. The Sycharusan ships, refit for close quarters ramming and boarding, destroys the Athenians, so Athens has to send more reinforcements under Demosthenes. He proposes a night assault on the Epipolae, which was a high ridge, to break the stalemate. It almost works, until darkness, unfamiliar terrain, and confusion unravel the attack. Units run into each other, panic spreads, and the opportunity vanishes. Demosthenes immediately argues for withdrawal. Nicias hesitates, worried about morale, reputation, and the omens. Then, nature decides to do some trolling by throwing a lunar eclipse. Nicias consults religious experts and delays the departure during the prescribed period. The pause gives Sycharus and its allies exactly what they need: time to fortify, time to close the harbor with obstacles, and time to set conditions for a decisive fight. When Athens finally tries to punch out of the harbor, the battles are chaotic and brutal. The breakout fails, however. With ships and wrecked crews exhausted, the army abandons the fleet and attempts a land retreat. Sycharus and allies hound them day after day, cutting them off from water and rest. Demosthenes surrenders with his surrounded column. Nicias is captured soon after. Both generals are executed. Thousands of Athenian survivors are thrown into the stone quarries, where many die from exposure and disease. The strategic fallout is immediate. Athens has lost a full expeditionary force, experienced crews, officers, and ships that can't be replaced quickly. Allies around the Aegean reconsider their loyalties. Guided by Alcibiades, Sparta fortifies the Decala and Attica, choking Athenian resources at home. Persian money begins to flow to Sparta. All this means the balance of the Peloponnesian War tilts sharply away from Athens, who would go on to lose the war. Pope Urban II calls for a crusade in 1095, and before the trained nobles can organize, crowds of volunteers decide to leave early. This wave, later nicknamed the People's Crusade, is a patchwork of peasants, small knights, and camp followers, led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit. Zeal is abundant, but logistics are not. There's no unified command, no treasury, and no supply plan beyond, we'll find food on the way. Multiple columns set out in spring 1096. Some pass peacefully through Central Europe, others don't. A German contingent, led by Count Amico, commits pogroms against Jewish communities along the Rhine. Farther along the route, unruly bands clash with locals in Hungary and the Balkans when foraging turns into looting. This pilgrimage begins to look more like a refugee crisis with weapons. Emperor Alexios wants crusaders, just, the disciplined, pay-their-own-way kind. Faced with these early arrivals, he chooses containment over confrontation. Feed them, ferry them, and move them across the Bosphorus before they can cause more trouble in Byzantine territory. Basically, just make them someone else's problem. Once in Asia Minor, whatever discipline the People's Crusade have dissolves. The People's Crusade camps near Nicaea, and splinters into raiding parties in search of supplies and quick victories. They assume local Christians will rise to support them and that the enemy is scattered. Both assumptions are wrong. Sultan Kareli Arslan, who initially underestimated this force, returns quickly once he sees the opportunity. The decisive moment came in October 1096, near Civitate. Seljuk scouts track the raiders, bait them with reports of an easy target, and spring an ambush in the broken terrain. With no reserve, no scouting screen, and no clear chain of command, the Crusader formations collapse fast. Many are cut down in pursuit, others are driven into ravines or back towards the sea. Peter the Hermit, away in Constantinople seeking better coordination and supplies, survives only because he isn't there. A small Byzantine naval force rescues remnants along the coast, but the expedition, as a military enterprise, ceases to exist. In 1716, France was buried under war debt. Esther John Law, Scottish gambler turned monetary theorist, who convinces the regent Philippe d'Orléans to try a new mix: a private bank issuing paper money and a trading company with monopoly rights over France's overseas commerce. The bank prints notes backed by confidence in the state. The company absorbs tax farms, mints, and multiple chartered trades. On paper, France gets a unified fiscal engine. In practice, money printer basically goes brrr. The mechanism is simple and powerful. The crown's high-interest debt is swapped for shares in the company. Investors can buy those shares partly with banknotes that the same system is expanding. Rising share prices make investors richer on paper, which makes the notes feel safer, which feeds more buying. Meanwhile, Law advertises Louisiana as a vast engine of furs, land, and river trade, enough to justify the high valuations. It's a circular design. Credit fuels shares, shares validate credit. By 1719, the company acquired more monopolies: tobacco, African trade, and East Indian trade routes, swelling its promised cash flows. Share subscriptions are staged in series, and each new tranche arrives at a higher price. Paris's Rue Quincampoix turns into a street exchange. Fortunes are made, servants become speculators, and the money supply surges as the bank prints to meet the moment. Prices of everyday goods climb, the line between prosperity and inflation then starts to blur. To sustain momentum, the state gives Law more levers. The bank becomes royal, notes are accepted for taxes, and gold and silver face withdrawal limits. That last step matters. Restricting coin pushes people towards paper, until it pushes them out of confidence. By early 1720, skepticism grows. Just how many settlers, shipments, and audited accounts justify these valuations? Well, the answer is it can't. Attempts to manage the descent, merging the bank back into the company, changing note denominations, degrees to cap or adjust share prices, all signals stress instead of strength. When confidence breaks, it breaks fast. By mid-1720, the share price collapses. Falling shares undermine notes, weaker notes force selling, selling drives shares lower. Law, briefly Controller General of Finances at the peak, flees into exile by the year's end. The regent unwinds the system, prosecutes some insiders, and restores a stricter metallic standard. Investors who did not exit early absorb heavy losses. The French state's credit suffers long after, and the political elites became wary of large-scale paper experiments tied to state finance. In 1961, the United States tries to remove Fidel Castro without admitting it's trying to remove Fidel Castro. The CIA's genius plan, approved in the final Eisenhower months and inherited by President Kennedy, builds a Cuban exile force, Brigade 2506, trained and equipped abroad for an amphibious landing that will spark a nationwide uprising. However, the political strain is plausible deniability, while the operational requirement is overwhelming air and logistical support. These two ideas are not really friends. Success depends on destroying Castro's air force on the ground, so that supply ships and landing craft can operate safely. On April 15, 1961, B-26 bombers, flown by exile pilots, strike Cuban airfields. The attacks damage some aircraft, but do not entirely eliminate the threat. Under diplomatic pressure after a botched cover story at the United Nations, Kennedy cancels a second, larger airstrike scheduled to finish the job. From that moment, the landing force will face enemy aircraft it was never designed to fight. Brigade 2506 goes ashore before dawn on April 17 at the Bay of Pigs, Playa Larga, and Playa Giron, on a coastline fringed with swamp and poor exit routes. The landing begins with predictable friction. Coral heads the planners marked as seaweed, scattered units, and difficulty moving inland. Local militias respond quickly, and regular Cuban forces converge by road. Most importantly, Cuban T-33 jets and Sea Fury fighters survive the first strikes, take to air, and start sinking the brigade's supply ships. When a transport explodes and others turn back, the beachhead runs short on ammunition, heavy weapons, and fuel, exactly what an isolated landing cannot afford to lose. Air cover becomes the decisive variable. Exile-flown B-26 invaders still fly, but without neutralizing Cuban fighters or having U.S. Navy carriers overtly provide fighter protection. They're exposed and atrophied. A last-minute compromise authorizes a brief, tightly constrained air mission launched from Nicaragua. Timing and navigation errors mean it arrives as the beachhead is collapsing, however. In practice, the political ceiling prevents the sort of sustained, layered air control that an amphibious assault requires. On the ground, the brigade fights hard and briefly expands a perimeter, but every hour tightens the noose. Cuban armor and artillery arrive, the roads remain in government hands, and the beaches offer no depth to maneuver. With supply ships sunk or withdrawn, and no realistic prospect of reinforcement, the position is untenable. By the end of the day, organized resistance ends. Roughly 100 brigade members are killed, and about 1,100 are captured. Cuban government casualties are significantly higher, but that doesn't alter the result. Strategically, the failure has immediate effects. Castro's position inside Cuba strengthens as he points to a repelled invasion to justify consolidating control. Internationally, Havana moves closer to Moscow for security guarantees, accelerating the path to the Soviet missiles on the island the following year. For Washington, the plausible deniability collapses into public embarrassment, and internal reviews conclude the plan's political constraints were incompatible with its military needs. The United States later negotiates the release of captured brigade members in exchange for food and medicine.